The desert stretched endless under a punishing sun, heat shimmering across the horizon. Calderon rode slow, his horse's hooves sinking into the dust, his eyes scanning the wasteland for anything more than sand and stone. Then he saw it, an old wooden well, half collapsed, leaning like a drunk against the emptiness. But it wasn't the well that made him pull the reins. A figure. At first he thought it was a mirage. A woman bound to the post, her head hanging low, dark hair plastered to her face with sweat. Her wrists were tied cruelly tight with rope, and the sun had baked her skin to a pale, cracked canvas. He swung down, boots crunching in the grit. He moved slow, wary. The desert wasn't kind to fools. Sometimes a trap looked just like mercy. He touched the brim of his hat, eyes narrowing as he studied her face. Alive. Barely. Her lips parted with a rasp of air. Water. Calderon's hand hovered near his canteen. He glanced around the desert one more time, finger brushing the butt of his revolver. Whoever left her here might still be close. Calderon crouched low, the leather of his coat creaking as he tugged at the ropes biting into her woman's wrists. Her skin was raw, rubbed near to bleeding. Whoever tied her wanted her to suffer, not die quick. The knots were cruel, tight as iron. She flinched when my knife touched the cords, eyes snapping open, dark eyes, sharp, wary, with the glint of someone who had learned not to trust. She strained back against the post, breath ragged. "I ain't here to hurt you," Calderon muttered, voice low, steady as the desert wind. "Hold still." The blade worked quick. The rope gave way. She collapsed forward, catching herself on trembling hands. Calderon eased her down, uncorking his canteen. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. When she finally looked up, her voice was a whisper, broken but steady. "Ida." Calderon nodded once. Calderon. No more words. The desert swallowed silence between them, but already something unspoken had taken root. Suspicion, gratitude, and a question neither dared to ask. Night fell fast on the desert, the heat of day giving way to a sharp, biting cold. Calderon built a small fire, the flames snapping against the dry wood he'd gathered. He sat cross-legged beside it, hat pulled low, watching the sparks climb toward the stars. Across from him, Ida sat hunched, wrapped in a blanket he'd dug out of his saddlebag. She hadn't spoken since giving her name. The firelight painted her face in flickers, eyes shadowed, lips pressed tight, hands trembling just enough to show she hadn't yet recovered. Calderon chewed on a strip of jerky, the leather-tough meat grinding in his teeth. He didn't offer any. Instead, he pushed a tin cup of water across the sand between them. She took it without a word, sipping slow this time. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing through the dark. Calderon's hand drifted near his revolver, instinct more than thought. She finally spoke, voice soft, almost swallowed by the fire's crackle. "Why stop? You could have ridden on." Calderon met her eyes, steady as stone. "Didn't seem right." She said no more, but in the silence, the fire seemed to burn warmer. The fire burned low, glowing embers settling into the sand. Calderon leaned back against his saddle, hat tilted over his eyes, pretending to sleep. But his ears stayed sharp. Out here, sleep was a luxury only fools trusted. Across from him, Ada sat with knees pulled to her chest, staring into the dying flames. Her lips moved once, then again, before the words finally carried. They tied me there to die." Calderon shifted the brim of his hat up. Her voice was flat, stripped of fear, but the weight behind it pressed against the silence. "Who?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "Men I once trusted, thought I was worth something to 'em, found out I was only bait." She shook her head, dark hair falling across her face. "They'll come back thinking I'm still there." Calderon rubbed his thumb along the edge of his revolver. "And if they find you gone?" Her eyes flicked to him, sharp in the firelight. "Then they'll be looking for the man who cut me loose." The night grew heavier. Above them, the stars seemed colder. Calderon sighed through his nose. Figures. Dawn spilled pale light across the desert, turning the horizon a bruised shade of purple and gold. Calderon saddled his horse in silence, every motion slow, deliberate. The fire was dead, nothing left but a smudge of ash in the sand. Ayla stood nearby, arms folded, the blanket still around her shoulders. She hadn't slept much, if at all. Her eyes were dark with worry, though her jaw was set firm. "They'll find us," she said finally. Calderon nodded once. "Ain't about if, it's when." He cinched the saddle tight, scanning the open desert. Wide, bare land offered no cover. Whatever was coming, they'd meet it head on. And Calderon knew one thing for certain: her past had just become his problem. By mid-morning, Calderon had led them to a scrubby rise overlooking the desert floor. From up top, the land stretched endless, every ridge and shadow plain to the eye. He reined in, scanning the distance. The riders weren't in sight, but he knew they were there, waiting. Ada's breath caught, but she didn't speak. Calderon rose, hand falling to the butt of his revolver. He looked at her then, really looked. Dust in her hair, lines of fatigue etched across her face, but no weakness in her eyes. "They'll find us," she said finally. Calderon nodded once. "Ain't about if, it's when." He cinched the saddle tight, scanning the open desert. Wide, bare land offered no cover. Whatever was coming, they'd meet it head on. And Calderon knew one thing for certain: her past had just become his problem. The days stretched long across the prairie. Sun by day, cold stars by night. The land rolling out endless beneath their horses' hooves. Calderon and Ida rode in silence mostly, words too thin to waste on the wind. But in that silence, something settled between them, an understanding. He'd catch her watching him sometimes, her gaze steady, curious, not fearful anymore. She no longer flinched when his hand brushed near his revolver or when his horse sidestepped sudden. Instead, she mirrored his movements, learning by watching. At camp, she gathered wood without being asked, her hand sure despite the blisters. She even cleaned the knife he'd used to cut her free, holding it with respect before handing it back. Calderon said little, but he noticed. One night, as coyotes sang, she spoke softly. "You don't ask questions." Calderon stared into the fire. "Figure if a person wants to tell, they will." Her silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was trust, growing slow, like roots under dry earth. And Calderon felt the weight of it, something fragile, something dangerous. The land changed as they pressed north. the desert giving way to broken stone and cottonwoods. By afternoon, they reached a river swollen from spring rains, the water dark and fast, foaming wide at the rocks. Calderon pulled his horse up at the bank, eyes narrowing. "She's running high." Ida sat astride her mount, jaw firm though her hands gripped the reins tight. "We can make it." He looked at her, saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had kept her alive at the well. He nodded once. "Stay close." They urged the horses forward. Water surged against their legs, cold and powerful, dragging at the animals. Calderon's horse fought through, but behind him, Ida's mount stumbled, hooves slipping on slick stone. "Calderon!" He wheeled back, spurring hard. The current had nearly swept her horse sideways. With one arm, he caught her, hauling her toward him as her mount scrambled back to shore. For a moment they were pressed close, her breath sharp against his neck. She steadied, meeting his eyes. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting to ride beside him. That night, the river's roar faded into the distance, but the air still carried damp chill. Calderon built a fire in a hollow of rocks, its glow pushing back the shadows. Ida sat across from him, drying her hair with her fingers, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. For a long while, only the fire spoke. Then, quietly, she began. "They left me there because I wouldn't do what they wanted." Calderon stared into the fire. "Figure if a person wants to tell, they will." Her silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was trust, growing slow like roots under dry earth. And Calderon felt the weight of it, something fragile, something dangerous. "They left me there because I wouldn't do what they wanted. They wanted me to lure men in, bait for an ambush, said no one would expect a woman. I refused, so they tied me to that well and left me for the sun." Her words cracked once, but her gaze never wavered. Calderon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're tougher than they reckoned," he said simply. Her lips parted, surprise softening her face. Then, for the first time, a faint smile flickered there, small but real. For Calderon, it was proof. Ida wasn't just surviving, she was reclaiming herself, piece by piece. The moon rode high, pale and sharp against the dark. Calderon's instincts kept him half awake, one hand always near his revolver. Ida lay rolled in her blanket a few feet from the fire, her breathing steady. Then a sound broke the night, hooves, slow, deliberate. Calderon's eyes snapped open. He slid his revolver free, rising without a sound. In the distance, shadows moved against the horizon, 3 riders, maybe 4, closing in. "Ida," he whispered. She stirred, then sat up, her hand gripping the knife he'd given her. The riders came fast now, rifles glinting in the moonlight. Calderon fired first, the crack splitting the silence. One rider toppled from the saddle, the other scattered, shots ringing through the night. Ida crouched low, blade flashing in her hand. When one rider charged too close, she slashed at the reins, the horse rearing and thrown its rider to the dust. Together, side by side, they fought off the attack until the last rider fled into the darkness. Breathing hard, Calderon glanced at her. She wasn't a victim, not anymore. She was a fighter, and she was his ally now. The desert grew quiet again, the echoes of gunfire fading into the night. Smoke from Calderon's revolver curled upward, stinging his nose. He lowered the weapon slowly, eyes scanning the dark for any sign of movement. Nothing. The riders were gone. Ida stood near him, chest heaving, the knife still clutched in her hand. The firelight caught her face, smeared with dust, eyes sharp and alive. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she dropped the knife, letting it sink into the sand. "They'll come back," she said finally, her voice steady. Calderon nodded. "Maybe, but you held your ground tonight." Her eyes met his, fierce and unflinching. "I won't run again." Something shifted then, something deeper than survival. Calderon saw it in the way she stood tall, no longer the broken figure tied to a post. She was equal to him now, forged in the same fire. He holstered his gun and gave her the smallest nod, one warrior to another. For the first time, they weren't just two strangers thrown together. They were a pair. The morning came slow, gold light spilling over the horizon and painting the desert in fire. Calderon packed his saddle, the quiet routine grounding him after the night's violence. Ida stood nearby, watching the sun climb, her blanket draped over her shoulders. "You could head east," he said, finally. "There's a settlement not 2 days' ride. Safer there." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped closer. Her hand came to rest on his arm, gentle but firm. "I've had enough of being left behind." Calderon turned his head, meeting her gaze. There was no plea in her eyes, no fear, only resolve. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded once. "I ride with you." For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, then Calderon gave a slow, rare smile. He swung into the saddle and offered his hand. She took it, pulling herself up behind him. Together, they turned west, into the endless horizon. Two riders now, bound by choice, by fire, by survival. The trail ahead was uncertain, but they rode it side by side,